Who invited her looking like that?" My brother didn't whisper it. He practically shouted across my dad's luxury birthday party, "Can't afford new clothes." He laughed, eyes locked on my thrift store dress. His wife didn't even blink. With her abilities, secondhand is probably all she deserves. Every head turned, every eye judged. No one said a word. Neither did I. Because just then, the restaurant owner walked straight up to our table, smiled, and said, "It's an honor to serve you, Miss Ivy." The silence that followed, louder than their laughter. For a heartbeat, I thought I'd imagined it. The way his voice carried calm, respectful, unmistakably certain. The way his eyes didn't skim past me like everyone else's had. He stood there waiting as if this moment belonged to us alone. And the room packed with people who had spent the last 10 minutes measuring me against the price tags they couldn't see froze. My brother's smile cracked first. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't shatter. It simply slipped, like a mask losing its grip. His wife blinked once, then twice, as if she'd missed a line in a script she thought she knew by heart. My father's face tightened in confusion, the proud host suddenly unsure of the seating arrangement he'd rehearsed all night. I felt it then, the shift. A current running under the polished tables and carefully plated dishes. People leaned in without meaning to. A few turned their heads toward the owner waiting for clarification, a punchline, anything to make this make sense again. But the owner didn't explain. He didn't need to. He nodded once at me, professional and warm, and moved on to greet another table. Just like that, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if he hadn't just rearranged the room. I exhaled slowly. My hands were steady. That surprised me. Minutes earlier, I'd been standing at the edge of the party, wondering if I should have stayed home. The invitation had come late, an afterthought wrapped in polite obligation. My father's milestone birthday, hosted at a restaurant he'd been bragging about for weeks. "The best place in the city," he'd said. "It's hard to get a reservation." He'd said it the way he said most things lately as proof. Of success, of taste, of being the kind of man people listen to. I listened too. I always did. I'd chosen the dress on purpose. Simple, clean lines, no logos. The kind of piece you could wear anywhere and belong nowhere. I'd found it secondhand months ago, tucked between sequins and synthetics, and it fit like it had been waiting. I didn't think about it again until I stepped into the restaurant and felt the room size me up. My brother had already been holding court, telling a story that involved numbers and influence, and how hard he'd worked to make things happen. His wife laughed at all the right moments. My father basked in it. The golden glow of approval had always followed my brother around like a spotlight. I knew the choreography. When my brother spotted me, his laugh changed pitch, sharper, performative. He looked at me the way someone looks at a smudge on glass, annoyed that it interrupts the view. And then he said it. I could have responded. I had words ready, I always did. Years of practice had made me fluent in deflection in small smiles and smaller explanations. But something in me stalled. Not fear, not a shock, just a tired clarity. I didn't want to spend another evening translating myself into something palatable, so I stayed quiet. The insult landed anyway. It always does. It doesn't need permission. It feeds on the space it creates. People shifted, embarrassed for me, or embarrassed to be seen with me, I couldn't tell which. A woman at the next table glanced down at her own dress, then back at mine, relief flickering across her face. Comparison is a reflex. Then the owner arrived. After he left, conversation crept back in, tentative and uneven. My brother cleared his throat and tried to reclaim the rhythm. "Great place, right?" he said too loudly. "Told you all it was impressive." He laughed again, but this time it sounded like he was alone. My father finally turned to me. "Do you know him?" he asked casually, but his eyes searched my face like they might find a clue he'd missed. "Not personally," I said. It was true enough. The rest of the meal unfolded with the carefulness of people walking on newly cracked ice. Dishes arrived. Glasses were refilled. Compliments were paid to the chef. But something fundamental had shifted. The assumptions that had entered the room so confidently were now unsure of their footing. I watched it happen from my seat. The way my brother stopped interrupting me. The way his wife avoided my eyes. The way my father's pride dulled into something closer to curiosity. No one apologized. No one asked questions that mattered. But the ease was gone, and in its place was something brittle. I felt strangely hollow, not victorious, not vindicated, just emptied, as if a long-held weight had slipped free and left a bruise in its absence. This wasn't how I'd imagined things ending up. Not tonight, not ever. I'd grown up learning how to be small in rooms like this, how to keep my voice even, how to dress for the expectations of people who believed success had a uniform. I'd learned when to speak and when silence would cost me less. I'd learned that being the responsible one meant absorbing the discomfort so others could stay comfortable. Tonight, all of that training felt suddenly obsolete. When dessert was served, my brother declined. He said he was full. His wife checked her phone. My father asked me if I was enjoying myself. I nodded, because that's what I'd always done. But inside, something had cracked open. I realized with a clarity that startled me that I'd crossed an invisible line the moment the owner said my name. Not because of what it revealed, but because of what it took away. I could no longer pretend this was just how things were. I could no longer hide behind the idea that staying quiet kept the peace. The peace had never been for me. As the party wound down, guests filtered out with polite goodbyes and practiced smiles. A few lingered curiosity tugging at them. One woman touched my arm lightly and said, "Lovely dress." Her tone had changed, softer, respectful. I thanked her and watched her leave. Outside, the night air was cool. I stood by the entrance for a moment, listening to the city breathe. My brother avoided me as he walked past keys already in hand. His wife followed, heels clicking too fast. My father hesitated, then said he'd see me soon. I nodded again. When I finally turned away, I didn't feel like I'd won anything. I felt like I'd lost something I couldn't name. The version of myself that believed enduring quietly was the same as being strong. The comfort of invisibility. The safety of being underestimated. I didn't know what would come next. I only knew that whatever had just begun, it couldn't be undone. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't shrink from that thought. I stayed at the table after everything went quiet, after the laughter collapsed into awkward movement, and people pretended the moment hadn't just split the room in half. Plates were adjusted. Someone asked for another drink. A woman at the end of the table complimented the lighting as if ambiance could erase what had been said. No one addressed it. No one apologized. The humiliation didn't echo because it didn't need to. It fit too neatly into the space that had already been prepared for it. That was the part that hurt most. Not the words themselves, but how easily everyone slid back into normal like this was a scene they'd rehearsed before. I watched my brother reclaim the conversation inch by inch. He leaned forward, told a story louder than necessary, drew laughter where he wanted it. His confidence didn't falter because to him nothing unusual had happened. He hadn't crossed a line. He'd simply spoken from a position he'd always been allowed to occupy. The room followed him without question. It always had. Growing up, he was introduced first. The pride in my father's voice sharpened when he said his name. Every family gathering began with an update on my brother's life, what he was working on, what he was planning next, what risk he'd taken that week. Even his mistakes were framed generously. He wasn't reckless, he was bold. He wasn't wrong, he was learning. Ambition covered everything like a varnish, glossy and forgiving. When it came to me, the language changed. I was doing fine, I was keeping busy, I was independent. Words that sounded positive but didn't invite follow-up. No one asked what I wanted next. No one asked what I was building. The assumption was always that I'd figure it out quietly on my own without disrupting the flow of other people's narratives. My father didn't mean to hurt me. That was the hardest part to accept. He wasn't cruel, he was simply consistent. My brother reminded him of himself, same confidence, same impatience, same belief that the world responded best to force. I was different, thoughtful, careful, and in a family that equated volume with value, that difference was misread as absence. There was a Thanksgiving dinner 7 years ago that I still carry with me. The whole family had gathered at my father's house. I'd just closed my first real investment, a small stake in a tech startup that would later return 12 times what I'd put in. I was 26, and I'd done it without help, without connections, without anyone knowing I'd been studying markets since college. I mentioned it during dinner, not to brag, just to share. My father nodded, said, "That's nice," and then turned to my brother to ask about his new car. The conversation never came back to me. Another time at a cousin's wedding, my brother announced he was starting a new business venture. The room applauded. People asked questions. My father offered to connect him with investors he knew. When I mentioned I'd already been running a small investment fund for 3 years, quietly managing money for a few clients who trusted me, my brother laughed and said, "That's not really a business, Ivy, that's a hobby." Everyone laughed with him. My father didn't correct him. I smiled and changed the subject. The worst was the year I asked for help. Not money, just support. A recommendation to a banking partner who could open doors I couldn't reach on my own. I'd done the research. I knew exactly what I needed. My brother laughed and said I didn't need it, that I was low maintenance. My father agreed, relieved, and the subject closed. I learned then that asking only reinforced the idea that I was the one who didn't require attention, that being easy made me invisible. Over time, my silence hardened into something people mistook for personality. "You're just quiet," they'd say, as if it explained everything. They stopped checking in, stopped waiting for my input. Decisions were made around me, not with me. My absence from the conversation became proof that I didn't belong in it. The role solidified not because I chose it, but because everyone else found it convenient. Sitting at the table that night, I understood something with startling clarity. My brother's comment didn't come out of nowhere. It was the natural conclusion of years spent watching me take up less space. He believed he was entitled to laugh because no one had ever corrected him before. His wife followed his lead not out of malice, but because she'd stepped into a system where my position had already been defined. She'd learned the hierarchy quickly. We all had. That realization settled over me slowly, like a weight I'd been carrying without noticing. It wasn't that I hadn't been good enough. It wasn't that I hadn't tried. It was that the story had been written early, and I'd been cast without my consent. Explaining myself hadn't changed it before, and it wouldn't change it now. Words bounced off a structure that didn't recognize them. I looked around the table again. Faces familiar enough to predict. People who thought they knew me because they'd labeled me years ago. They saw the version of me that didn't interrupt, didn't compete, didn't demand. They didn't see the parts that lived outside their field of vision. And for the first time, I didn't want them to not in the old way. The party continued, but something in me had stepped back from the stage. I realized I didn't need to correct their assumptions. I didn't need to rewrite my role inside a script that had never been mine. I could simply leave the scene altogether. Not physically, not yet, but emotionally, mentally, quietly, the way I always did things. They thought they knew who I was, but they only knew the part I'd been assigned. Chungba, the dress they misunderstood, Daching Sua. I chose the dress the same way I chose most things in my life, quietly, without asking for permission, without rehearsing an explanation for anyone who didn't need one. The afternoon light slanted through my bedroom window as I laid it out on the bed and smoothed the fabric once with my hand, not checking for flaws, not questioning the choice, just acknowledging it. I knew how this would look to them. I wasn't naive. I understood the language of family gatherings, the unspoken dress code that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with signaling. I could have chosen something safer. I owned clothes that blended in better clothes that carried the right weight, the right assumptions. I'd worn them before. They'd earned me nods of approval and the occasional surprised comment about how put together I looked, as if that version of me were a temporary upgrade rather than a person. But every time I tried to dress the part, they expected something in me went quiet in the wrong way. It wasn't peace. It was erased. I'd stand in front of the mirror and see someone who looked acceptable but felt borrowed, like I was wearing proof that I could behave if required. Over time, I'd learned that fitting in came with a cost I no longer wanted to pay. The dress on my bed wasn't expensive. It wasn't meant to be. I'd found it months earlier while wandering through a thrift store on a weekday afternoon, the kind of place where time loosened its grip and nothing demanded urgency. It wasn't hidden or rare. It simply felt right. The fabric had weight without stiffness lines, without pretense. When I tried it on, there was no performance in the mirror, no audition, just recognition. People assumed thrift meant compromise, that choosing secondhand was a concession to limitation, a sign of lack dressed up as intention. They were wrong. I'd owned new clothes, expensive ones, pieces that came with receipts and expectations. I'd worn them to events where people smiled approvingly and still didn't listen to what I had to say. Price had never translated into presence. Labels had never bought me authority. Thrift gave me something else, freedom. It stripped away the need to impress and left only the question that mattered: does this feel like me? No brand could answer that. No trend could decide it for me. When I wore something without a story, people recognized they had nothing to attach their assumptions to. That unsettled them. I didn't mind. As I got dressed, my mind drifted to Christmas 2 years ago. The whole family had gathered at my father's house, and I'd worn a simple navy dress I'd picked up at a consignment shop downtown. Nothing flashy, nothing worn, just understated. I'd thought nothing of it until my Aunt Linda pulled me aside near the kitchen. She placed her hand on my arm the way people do when they're about to say something they think is kind. Her eyes swept over my dress, then back to my face. "Oh, honey," she said, lowering her voice. "Are things tight right now? You know you can always ask if you need help. Family takes care of family." I felt my stomach tighten. "Everything's fine, Aunt Linda. I just liked the dress." She nodded, but her expression didn't change. That careful, pitying smile stayed fixed in place. "Of course, sweetheart. Of course." She patted my arm twice the way you might comfort a child who doesn't understand their own situation. "Just remember, we're here for you. No judgment." She walked away before I could respond, already moving toward my brother to compliment his new watch. I stood there for a moment holding my glass of wine, feeling the weight of her assumptions settle over me like a coat I hadn't asked to wear. That was the moment I understood something clearly. It didn't matter what I said. They had already decided who I was. My words would bounce off their conclusions like rain off glass. The only thing speaking would do was confirm their belief that I was defensive, that I had something to prove, that I was embarrassed by my circumstances. So I smiled. I changed the subject. And I'd spent the rest of the evening watching my family discuss my brother's latest purchase, while no one asked me a single question about my life. Standing in my bedroom now, I could still feel the ghost of that moment. The dress on my bed wasn't so different from the one I'd worn that Christmas, and I knew exactly what would happen when I walked into the restaurant tonight. The looks, the whispers, the careful concern masking judgment. There was a moment, brief but honest, when I considered changing anyway. My hand moved toward the closet, toward the designer dress still hanging in its dry cleaning bag. The one I'd bought 3 years ago for a client dinner back when I still thought the right outfit could buy me a seat at the table. I touched the plastic, felt the weight of the fabric underneath. It would be so easy. Put it on, blend in, avoid the commentary, get through the evening without becoming a topic of conversation. My fingers lingered on the hanger for a long moment, longer than I wanted to admit. Then I let go. Avoidance had never protected me. It had only postponed the inevitable stretched discomfort across time until it felt permanent. Tonight I didn't want to disappear quietly into the background and listen to my life be summarized inaccurately. I didn't want to spend the evening proving I could conform if needed. I wanted to arrive as myself and let the rest unfold without intervention. The party loomed in my mind as I gathered my things. I could already picture the room filled with polished confidence, the unspoken competition humming beneath polite conversation. I knew the dress would look out of place against that backdrop. I knew eyes would linger a second too long, assessing, categorizing. I felt the pressure of that knowledge settle in my chest, not as fear, but as weight. The kind you carry because you've decided it's worth it. Standing by the door, I paused once more in front of the mirror. This time I didn't search my face for reassurance. I didn't practice a smile or prepare a defense. I stood still and let myself be seen by the only person whose opinion mattered. I wasn't dressing to be accepted. I was dressing to avoid betraying myself. That distinction had taken me years to understand. When I stepped outside, the evening air was cool and indifferent. The world didn't care what I wore. The sidewalk didn't measure me. The sky didn't compare me to anyone else. That thought grounded me as I walked toward my car. They would notice the dress before they noticed me. I was certain of that. They would read into it whatever fit the story they already believed. Aunt Linda would probably pull me aside again, offer the same pitying smile, the same careful words. My brother would find a way to comment. My father would pretend not to notice while noticing everything. But for the first time, that story wasn't mine to correct. I closed the door behind me, the sound decisive, and left with the quiet certainty that whatever came next, I wouldn't be stepping into it by accident. I stepped into the restaurant and immediately felt the shift from solitude to spectacle, the kind that presses in from all sides without ever touching you. The space was loud with celebration voices overlapping in practiced cheer glasses lifted in synchronized gestures of belonging. People stood in clusters that had already decided who belonged where. I wasn't greeted, wasn't guided, wasn't pulled into any orbit. I paused just long enough to scan the room, then moved on my own, aware of how visible that small independence made me. The first looks came quickly. Glances that lingered a fraction longer than courtesy required. Eyes traveling from my face to my dress and back again, pausing as if something didn't quite add up. A woman near the entrance looked me over, then leaned toward her companion, lips moving without sound. Someone else smiled politely and turned away too fast. No one said anything. They didn't have to. The assessment was already happening. I made my way towards the family table, weaving past conversations that dipped and rose, careful not to interrupt. The farther I walked, the more aware I became of the contrast. Jackets cut to impress dresses, chosen to signal effort, the quiet uniform of people who knew how they wanted to be seen. My presence disrupted the pattern. I felt it in the slight hesitations, the recalibrations. I didn't shrink. I kept walking. The table was exactly as I expected. My brother at the center, voice carrying hands, moving as he spoke. He was mid-story, something about a deal that had required real risk, and the people around him leaned in at the right moments. My father sat close, listening, nodding, absorbed. There was a seat at the far edge for me, unclaimed and unnoticed. I took it without comment. For a while I was invisible again. Conversation flowed around me, not to me. Plates were set down. Laughter rose and fell. Someone asked my brother a question, and he answered with confidence sharpened by an audience. I listened quiet, by habit, my presence registered only as an outline at the margin. It would have been easy to stay there to let the night pass without friction. That's what they expected. The laughter came first, my brother's familiar and unrestrained. It cut through the conversation, demanded attention. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't check the room. He looked directly at me, then back at the table, as if inviting everyone to share the joke. The timing was deliberate, the moment chosen. "Can't afford new clothes," he said, laughing again, eyes fixed on my dress. The words landed cleanly without hesitation. Not a slip, not a mistake, a performance. There was a beat of silence, just long enough for the room to absorb it. A few people laughed uncertainly, others looked down at their plates. No one challenged him. He'd spoken from a place they all recognized. Before I could even register the full weight of it, his wife added her own line, softer, cooler, like a finishing touch. "With her abilities," she said, tilting her head slightly, "secondhand is probably all she deserves." That did it. The air shifted, thickened. Every head turned. Every eye found me. This time there was no pretense, no polite avoidance. They looked openly, curiously, like they were watching a demonstration. I felt the attention settle on my skin, heavy and exacting. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I didn't laugh it off. I stayed where I was, hands resting on the table, posture steady. I could feel the expectation pressing in the collective anticipation of a response, a protest, an explanation, an exit, anything to resolve the tension they'd just created. My silence stretched the moment. It made people uncomfortable. A few shifted in their seats. Someone cleared their throat. My brother's smile faltered just slightly, then sharpened again. He wasn't used to pauses that didn't belong to him. I glanced toward my father, just enough to see if he would intervene, if he would say something to redirect the moment. His eyes flicked between us. He hesitated. The calculation was visible, the internal weighing of disruption versus comfort. Then he looked away, said nothing. That was the cut that went deepest. Not because I expected rescue, but because the absence of it confirmed what I already knew. Silence in that moment wasn't neutrality. It was a choice. Around us, the room tried to recover. A few people laughed again, this time more forced. Others avoided looking at me entirely, as if eye contact might imply complicity or courage. The humiliation had been delivered, acknowledged, and quietly approved. The system worked as designed. I stayed seated. I didn't leave. I didn't apologize for existing. That choice unsettled them more than any argument would have. My brother's expression tightened. He'd expected compliance in some form, defensiveness, embarrassment, retreat. Instead, he got stillness. It threw off his rhythm. Conversation attempted to resume, but it moved awkwardly now, stumbling over the space where something unresolved sat. My brother tried to reclaim control, raising his voice again, telling another story, laughing too loudly. It didn't land the same way. The room had changed. Not in my favor, not yet, but enough to be felt. The whispers began then, low and cautious. Not all of them are unkind, but none of them helpful. Pity crept in alongside judgment, and I found I preferred the latter. Pity still placed me below them. It still required me to accept their version of the story. They thought they'd taught me a lesson. That they'd reinforced the hierarchy reminded me where I belonged. What they didn't realize was that in making their assumptions so public, so unmistakable, they'd revealed more about themselves than they ever intended. The roles they clung to, the permissions they took for granted, the ease with which they justified cruelty when it was familiar. I didn't need to speak to understand it. I didn't need to defend myself to see it clearly. Sitting there under the weight of their attention, I felt something solidify. The humiliation wasn't the point. The point was the exposure, and once seen, it couldn't be unseen. The conversation at the table restarted with the efficiency of people trained to smooth over discomfort. Someone asked about dessert. Another person commented on the music. Plates were shifted, glasses refilled, laughter reintroduced in smaller, more careful doses. It was as if the moment that had just passed needed to be buried quickly before it contaminated the rest of the evening. I watched it happen in real time and understood something immediately. If I spoke now, if I objected or defended myself, I would become a disruption. Not an insult, not the cruelty. Me. That was the consequence of speaking up in a room like this, the way it forced me to become the problem while everyone else remained comfortable. The humiliation hadn't stopped the party. It hadn't even slowed it. It was absorbed, categorized as acceptable collateral. And if I refused to play along, if I insisted on naming what had just happened, I would be the one accused of ruining my father's birthday. I knew this pattern well. It had been rehearsed across years of gatherings, disagreements, and almost arguments that never quite made it into the open. The family meeting about the inheritance still burns in my memory. I was 24. My father had gathered us to discuss how assets would eventually be divided. My brother received a detailed breakdown properties investment accounts, the family business shares. When it came to my portion, my father waved his hand vaguely and said, "Ivy will be fine. She's always been independent." My brother nodded, satisfied. I asked what that meant exactly. My father sighed and said I was overthinking it. The meeting ended. The topic never came up again. I learned then that asking questions was interpreted as greed, while my brother's expectations were simply understood as reasonable. Another time, I'd tried to explain why I couldn't attend a family vacation they'd planned without consulting me. I had a critical meeting with a potential banking partner, the kind of opportunity that could change everything for my fund. My brother laughed and said I was playing businesswoman. My father said I should prioritize family. When I pointed out that no one had asked about my schedule before booking, I was told I was being difficult. The vacation happened without me. No one called to check in. The worst was when I finally responded to one of my brother's comments at a dinner party. He'd made a joke about how I'd never amount to much, and everyone laughed. I looked at him directly and said calmly, "You don't actually know anything about what I do." The table went silent. Then my brother smiled and said to everyone, "See? She's always been jealous." The words stuck immediately. From then on, any objection from me could be dismissed with that single label. Each time I spoke up, the outcome was the same. The structure didn't bend. It reinforced itself. My words were absorbed and repurposed as evidence of my inadequacy. That understanding sharpened at the table that night. I watched how quickly the room adjusted, how effortlessly people chose comfort over fairness. In rooms like this, the person who reacts to disrespect becomes the problem. The person who delivers it, if they belong to the right group, is excused as blunt, honest, or joking. My brother had power here. He always had. He was the center of gravity. I was at best a detail. If I challenged him publicly, I wouldn't be heard as someone standing up for herself. I'd be heard as someone disrupting the order. So I stayed quiet, not to endure, but to observe. Silence gave me something speech never had: clarity. I noticed who laughed immediately and who hesitated, who avoided my eyes and who looked at me with something like discomfort. I noticed how quickly people accepted the insult as truth, how little resistance it encountered. No one looked surprised. That told me this wasn't an anomaly. It was permission exercised. I watched my brother closely. He waited for my reaction even as he tried to mask it with another joke. His confidence relied on response. Without it, he seemed momentarily unmoored. His wife glanced around the table, gauging the room, adjusting her posture. That was when the decision crystallized. Speaking now would cost me control. Silence would preserve it. I asked myself what I stood to gain from defending myself in that moment. An apology, unlikely. Understanding, even less so. I'd gain the temporary relief of having said something, followed by the familiar aftermath of being told I'd overreacted. If I stayed silent, I would keep something more valuable. I would keep my dignity. I would deny them the satisfaction of watching me scramble for approval. I would refuse to validate the role they'd assigned me by playing it correctly. They mistook my silence for surrender. That was the irony. They thought I'd accepted my place. What they didn't see was that I had simply stopped participating in the exchange altogether. I wasn't arguing within their framework. I was stepping outside of it. They believed silence meant defeat. What they didn't understand was that some confrontations don't begin with words. Some only start once you stop giving the other side what it expects. The silence didn't break. It stretched, thickened, and settled over the table like a held breath no one wanted to release first. Conversations nearby resumed in fragments, but ours lagged behind, stalled by something none of them could quite name. I stayed where I was, hands folded loosely, posture unchanged. I wasn't bracing for anything. I wasn't retreating either. That was when I noticed the movement before anyone else did, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was deliberate. From the corner of my vision, a figure stepped away from the edge of the room and began walking toward us, not hesitating, not scanning, just moving forward with a certainty that cuts cleanly through the noise. I didn't turn my head. I didn't need to. The shift in attention rippled ahead of him. Conversations dipped. Someone straightened in their seat. Someone else paused mid-sentence. He stopped beside our table, not at its head, not near my brother, not anywhere that would have made sense under the old hierarchy. He stopped next to me. I felt it then, the subtle recalibration of the room, the way eyes redirected themselves, reassessing the scene with new information they didn't yet understand. "Miss Ivy," he said, his voice measured and clear, cutting through what little chatter remained. "It's an honor to serve you this evening." The words landed and stayed. My brother's laughter died mid-breath. His wife's expression froze, then slipped just enough to reveal the calculation underneath. My father looked up sharply, the movement almost involuntary, as though a sound he hadn't expected had finally reached him. No one spoke. No one laughed it off. No one questioned the introduction. In that moment, the owner's authority outweighed whatever assumptions had governed the table seconds before. I met his gaze and nodded just once. "Thank you," I said, keeping my voice level, offering nothing more. I didn't explain. I didn't expand. I didn't soften the moment for anyone else's comfort. The owner smiled politely, inclined his head, and stepped back, already turning away, his part complete. He hadn't lingered. He hadn't clarified. He hadn't needed to. The effect lingered everywhere. The room didn't rush to fill the silence this time. It sat in it, examining the implications. The people who had been so quick to laugh earlier now studied their plates, their glasses, anything but me. The ones who had stayed quiet before looked alert, suddenly aware that the ground beneath them might not be as stable as they'd thought. My brother recovered first, or tried to. He let out a small laugh, lighter than before, aimed at no one in particular. "Guess they're really stepping up the service tonight," he said, as if the comment could be folded neatly back into the evening. The joke hovered unsupported. No one picked it up. His wife didn't smile. She didn't speak at all. Her eyes flicked to me, then away. My father remained silent. He watched me with an intensity that hadn't been there before, as though he were seeing a familiar object under unfamiliar light. He didn't ask the obvious question. He didn't ask any questions. Instead, he observed his attention caught between the composure I'd maintained all evening and the respect the owner had shown without explanation. Around us, the party pressed on, but the tone had changed. No one commented on my clothes now. No one made jokes at my expense. The absence was noticeable, heavy with implication. People spoke more carefully. Laughter, measured glances, guarded. The certainty they'd worn earlier had thinned, replaced by something closer to caution. I stayed silent, not because I couldn't speak, but because silence had taken on a different quality. Before it had been interpreted as weakness, as acquiescence. Now it reads as restraint, as a choice. The less I said, the more space the truth seemed to occupy on its own. I could feel the questions forming unasked, piling up behind polite expressions. Who was I to the owner? Why had he addressed me that way? What did everyone else know that they didn't? My brother shifted in his seat, adjusting his jacket, glancing around as if searching for an ally. He'd always thrived on leading the room, on setting the tone and watching others follow. Now the room wasn't following. It was waiting. His voice, when he spoke again, lacked its earlier confidence. He commented on the menu, on the wine, on anything neutral enough to regain footing. It didn't work. The energy had moved past him. My father leaned slightly closer, not enough to be obvious, but enough that I noticed. He didn't speak, but his attention was fixed, searching for context. He had built his understanding of me on a set of quiet conclusions, none of which had accounted for this. The evening continued, but nothing returned to what it had been. Conversations skirted safer topics. People addressed me more carefully, some with a new politeness that bordered on deference, others with studied neutrality. No one asked outright. No one challenged the shift. They accepted it because authority had spoken, and authority rarely needed to explain itself. I didn't feel triumphant. What I felt was a steady clarity, a confirmation of something I'd suspected but never seen proven so cleanly. I hadn't needed to defend myself. I didn't need to correct anyone. The truth, once acknowledged by the right voice, carried its own weight. They didn't ask me who I was. They didn't ask what I did. And in their hesitation, in that collective pause, I understood something important. The questions had become dangerous. Whatever answer I might give now carried the power to finish what had already begun. The party kept moving, but the momentum had shifted in a way no one could quite undo. After my name was spoken out loud by someone whose authority the room instinctively trusted, everything continued under a new set of unspoken rules. Conversations resumed, but they skirted closer to neutral ground. Laughter returned, but it arrived late and left early. People looked at me differently now, not openly, not boldly, but with a careful curiosity that hadn't existed before. None of this was new to me. It only felt new to them. The first time I walked into this restaurant, it was a Tuesday afternoon 3 years ago. The place was nearly empty. No celebrity chef reputation yet. No waiting lists. Just a man named David Reynolds standing behind the bar, sleeves rolled up, going through receipts with the kind of focus that told me everything about how much of himself he'd poured into this place. I'd heard about the restaurant from a colleague in my investment fund, someone who mentioned it in passing as a place with potential but no capital. That phrase stuck with me. I'd built my career on recognizing exactly that combination. I didn't introduce myself with my last name. I didn't mention my family or their money. I walked in as a customer, ordered lunch, and watched. The food was excellent. The service was attentive but not rehearsed. The space had character without trying too hard. More importantly, I noticed how David spoke to his staff. He knew their names. He asked about their lives. When a young server made a mistake with an order, he corrected it quietly without embarrassment. After I finished eating, I asked if I could speak with the owner. David came over wiping his hands on a towel, clearly expecting a complaint. Instead, I asked him about his expansion plans. He laughed, surprised. Expansion I'm trying to make next month's rent. We talked for 2 hours. Not about prestige or growth strategies at first. About margins. About the cost of quality ingredients versus the markup customers would accept. About staff retention and why he refused to cut corners on employee meals. About the risks of growing too fast and the costs of staying small. He didn't sell me a dream. He showed me his reality. His books were open on the table within 30 minutes. His projections were conservative, almost pessimistic. When I asked what he would do with a significant investment, he didn't talk about Michelin stars or media coverage. He talked about fixing the ventilation system, hiring a second sous chef so his team wouldn't burn out, and finally replacing the walk-in freezer that broke down every other month. That was when I knew. This wasn't a man chasing glory. This was a man trying to build something real. I made my decision before I left that afternoon. I told him I wanted to invest. He asked who I was, with what firm, what fund. I told him it would come from me personally. He asked why. I said because I believed in what he was doing, and because I didn't need my name attached to it to know it was the right choice. We negotiated terms over the next 2 weeks. I was clear from the beginning I didn't want my name on the wall. I didn't want acknowledgement at events. I didn't want the relationship to become transactional in the way that visibility always makes things. I'd seen what happened when investors demanded recognition. Every interaction became a calculation. Every decision filtered through ego. I wanted distance, clarity, the ability to support something without becoming its story. David understood. He didn't question it. He recognized discretion as a form of trust. Over the next 3 years, we built a partnership that existed almost entirely outside public view. I came by occasionally, always as a regular customer. We spoke on the phone about quarterly numbers. When he needed additional capital for the second location, I provided it without hesitation. When a difficult landlord threatened to raise rent beyond reason, I connected him with a real estate attorney who specialized in exactly that kind of negotiation. I never asked for returns beyond what the business could genuinely provide. I never pressured him to grow faster than his team could handle, and he never once broke my confidence. That was how I became what I was to him, a silent backer. The kind who didn't attend openings or pose for photos, the kind who showed up quietly, checked in occasionally, and let the people doing the work take the credit. Calling my name that night hadn't been an attempt to expose me or elevate me. David had been watching from across the room when my brother made his comment. He'd seen the imbalance, the disrespect, and he'd acted the only way he knew how, by acknowledging me the way he always had, without theatrics, without explanation. Back at the table, my family didn't know any of this. They felt the shift without understanding its source, which made it all the more destabilizing. My brother sat straighter than before, his confidence thinning into something more brittle. He glanced at me once, then away, as if looking too closely might reveal something he wasn't ready to confront. His wife avoided my eyes entirely, now her earlier certainty replaced by a careful neutrality. My father watched me in a way he never had before, not critically, not dismissively, with attention. I could have explained. The truth was sitting right there, ready to be spoken. I could have eased the tension, clarified the confusion, and claimed the recognition I'd just been given. But ease wasn't the point. Timing was. The truth offered too soon would have been filtered through defensiveness and pride. So I kept quiet. They thought knowing the truth would bring me relief. They were wrong. Keeping it to myself, choosing when and how it would surface, gave me more control than any immediate reveal ever could. Chung Tain, the unseen gift, Damo Rong. The party didn't end when the music softened or when plates were cleared. It lingered suspended between what everyone pretended was normal and what none of them wanted to name. Guests smiled and compared schedules. Phones glowed briefly and disappeared. Coats were gathered with practiced ease. At our table, conversation became cautious, as if every sentence needed to be tested before it was spoken. When David took the microphone to thank everyone for coming, the room gave him its attention without effort. He spoke about milestones, about gratitude, about a year that deserved to be marked properly. Then he added something small delivered as a courtesy. Rather than a headline, the evening had been taken care of, fully covered as a gift. A gesture of appreciation meant to let the family enjoy the night without logistics. No name, no flourish, just a sentence that slid into the air and stayed there. My father blinked surprise flashing across his face before settling into a smile that looked like pride. He straightened, nodded, accepted the idea that someone somewhere had wanted to honor him. My brother leaned forward immediately, quick to fill the vacuum. "Must be one of Dad's old clients," he said, his voice aiming for casual authority. "You know how these things work. People remember favors." His wife nodded along. Her smile practiced, her hand resting at his arm, as if proximity alone could translate into credit. The room accepted it easily enough. Assumptions prefer familiar shapes. I watched him take credit for something he knew nothing about, watched his wife's smile widen as she basked in reflected importance. I watched my father beam at my brother as if this mysterious generosity had somehow been arranged through his connections. Something twisted in my chest. Not anger exactly, something older. Something I'd been carrying for years without naming it. I thought about what this dinner had cost me. $18,000. Not a small number. Not money I threw around carelessly. It represented months of careful planning, calculated returns, and patience. It was the exact amount I'd debated over for 3 days before finally committing. And now I was watching my brother smile and shrug, as if he'd somehow orchestrated the whole thing. For one sharp moment I wanted to say it. The words were right there, fully formed. It was me. I paid for everything. Every plate, every glass of wine, every dessert you're finishing right now. Me, not Dad's old client, not one of your connections. Me. My hand tightened around my water glass. I could feel the condensation against my palm, cold and real. But I didn't speak. I forced the words back down and took a slow breath, because I knew what would happen if I did. My brother would find a way to make it about him, how he didn't know how I should have said something, how it changed things now that money was involved. My father would feel awkward, maybe even embarrassed that his daughter had paid instead of him. The gift would become a debt. The gesture would become a transaction. And somehow, I would end up apologizing for making everyone uncomfortable. I'd seen it happen before. The birthday I'd surprised my father with a first edition book he'd mentioned wanting years ago. Instead of gratitude, I'd gotten questions. "Where did you find this? How much did it cost? Can you afford this?" My brother had joked that I must have gotten a windfall from somewhere. My father had set the book aside and never mentioned it again. The decision to pay for tonight hadn't been impulsive. Weeks earlier, when his plans were being made, the details debated and revised in a family group chat, I was added to as an afterthought. I'd noticed the tension creeping into conversations. It started with my brother messaging, "I can probably get us a deal at this new place downtown. Let me make some calls." Then my father responded, "Let's keep the budget reasonable. I don't want anyone overextending." Then my brother again, "Don't worry about the budget, Dad. I'll handle it." The subtext was clear. My brother was positioning himself as the provider, the organizer, the one who made things happen. My name hadn't come up once in the planning. I'd been added to the group chat 3 days before the party with a simple FYI and no request for input. I'd watched the messages pile up. Who would cover what, who would handle which piece, the unspoken competition beneath the logistics. My brother had been angling to control the venue choice, dropping hints about his connections and how he could probably get a deal. My father had been tracking every expense, worried about perception. I'd remembered birthdays past, how celebration always came with a price that wasn't listed on any invoice, the arguments after events about who had contributed enough, the resentment that lingered for months, the way generosity became a weapon and gratitude became a debt. My father's 60th birthday had been the worst. My brother had organized everything, then spent the next 6 months reminding everyone what it had cost him. Every family gathering included a reference to that party I threw for Dad. Every conversation about money circled back to his sacrifice. By the time Thanksgiving came, I'd heard the story so many times I could recite it word for word. I wanted this year to be different, not grander, cleaner. I wanted to remove the ammunition before it could be loaded. I called David privately 3 weeks before the party. We met at the restaurant during off hours, the dining room empty except for a few staff members setting up for the evening service. "I want to cover the entire event," I told him. "Everything. The private room, the prix-fixe menu, the wine pairings gratuity, all of it." He looked at me carefully. "That's a significant amount, Ivy. Are you sure?" "I'm sure." "And you don't want anyone to know?" "Correct. Announce it as a gift from the restaurant if you need to. A gesture for a valued guest. Whatever works. Just don't mention my name." He nodded slowly, understanding settling into his expression. Family stuff. Family stuff. He didn't ask more questions. That was one of the things I appreciated about David. He understood that some things didn't need to be explained. I'd written the check that afternoon. $18,247. I'd looked at the number for a long time before signing. It was more than I'd spent on myself in the past 2 years combined, more than my car, more than 6 months of rent on my apartment. But it wasn't about the money, not really. It was about removing myself from the equation entirely. If I'd offered to split the cost, it would have become a competition. If I'd paid openly, it would have become a story about me trying to show off. By paying anonymously, I was erasing myself from the narrative altogether, giving my father a birthday that wasn't shadowed by obligation or resentment. That was worth $18,000 to me. What I hadn't anticipated was how it would feel to sit here now watching my brother take credit. His wife was saying something about how generous people always recognized quality, how her husband had probably made an impression on someone important without even realizing it. My brother was nodding modestly, performing humility while accepting praise he hadn't earned. I felt the twist in my chest sharpen into something closer to pain. Was this what it would always be like? Would I always be invisible even when I was the one holding everything together? Would my contributions always be absorbed into someone else's story? For a moment, just a moment, I felt tears prick at the back of my eyes. Not from sadness, from exhaustion, from the sheer weight of being unseen for so long. I blinked them away before anyone could notice, reached for my water glass, took a long, slow sip. No, I wouldn't let this moment break me. I'd made a choice, and I'd made it for reasons that still held true. The gift wasn't about recognition. It was about love, about wanting for once to give my father something uncomplicated. If I spoke now, I would destroy exactly what I'd been trying to create. The moment I said the words, the gift would stop being a gift and start being evidence. It would become a weapon in an argument I didn't want to have. Proof of something I didn't want to prove. I didn't want it weighed. I didn't want it turned into leverage or obligation. I wanted it to remain what it was, a choice made quietly without expectation. Even if that meant watching someone else take credit. Even if that meant swallowing this particular pain in silence. A manager stopped by our table near the end of the night, checking in with professional warmth. He addressed my father respectfully, thanked him for choosing the venue, then glanced at me with recognition he didn't try to hide. "If there's anything you need, Miss Ivy," he said, his tone measured deferential. My father's head turned at that slowly. He didn't ask a question. He simply looked at me as if aligning two images that refused to sit neatly together. The manager moved on, unaware of the ripple he'd left behind. The discomfort sharpened. My brother's smile tightened, recalibrating. His wife shifted in her chair, scanning faces, reassessing the room. They were losing something intangible, the authority that comes from being certain you understand the hierarchy. I considered saying something then, a simple clarification, a quiet acknowledgement. The words were still there waiting. It would be so easy. But timing is a language of its own, and the room wasn't ready to hear it without translating it into something ugly. If I spoke, they would hear accusations. They would hear scorekeeping. They would hear a challenge. So I stayed silent, not as punishment, as preservation. Outside, the night air felt cooler than I expected. The building behind me held its glow, its promise, its carefully curated impression. I paused not to savor anything, but to settle myself. The pain in my chest had faded to something duller, more familiar. I'd carried it before. I would carry it again. But at least tonight, I'd carried it for a reason I chose. That made it different. That made it mine. Gifts given quietly have a way of echoing longer than the ones announced. They create a vacuum where certainty used to be, and in that space, truth starts to move. I didn't need them to know it was me. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I needed to know why I'd done it, and I did. Love doesn't require witnesses to be real, but secrets, even gentle ones, don't stay hidden forever. They wait. They gather weight. They find their moment. And when they surface, they don't ask permission. I walked to my car alone, the city quiet around me. $18,000, a year of invisibility, a lifetime of being underestimated. Somehow standing there in the parking lot, it all felt like it was finally starting to add up to something. When the last guest finally left the room, seemed to exhale. Chairs were pushed in without ceremony. The staff dimmed the lights to something softer, and the polished energy of the party drained away, leaving behind a quieter, heavier air. It was just us, now family without witnesses. The kind of silence that doesn't rush to be filled. I stayed seated for a moment longer than necessary, not because I was tired, but because I sensed that something had shifted, and I didn't want to move too quickly past it. My father stood near the end of the table, loosening his jacket, nodding absently at a server, as if he were still thanking guests in his head. He looked pleased, but not triumphant, thoughtful, not distracted. My brother lingered close by, phone in hand, scrolling without seeing, waiting for the room to reorganize itself around him again. His wife hovered at his side, her smile absent now that there was no one left to perform for. I felt my father's attention settle on me, the way you notice a change in light before you can name it. Not sharp, not interrogating, just a present. He hadn't looked at me like that in years. "You okay?" he asked finally. The question landed awkwardly, not because it was invasive, but because it was unfamiliar. He had asked me about logistics before, about timing, about whether I needed anything practical. He hadn't asked me how I felt, since I'd learned to give him answers that didn't inconvenience him. "I'm fine," I said, then corrected myself. "I had a good time." He nodded, accepting that without commentary. That alone surprised me. He leaned against the table the way he did when he was thinking, rather than directing. "It was a nice night," he said. "I didn't realize how much work you put into things like this." I didn't respond immediately, not because I was guarding a secret, but because I was measuring the space he'd opened. My brother shifted clearly, sensing the conversation drifting away from him. He cleared his throat, stepped forward slightly, and began to speak about the planning, about who had coordinated what, his voice trying to reassert a familiar rhythm. My father raised a hand, not sharply, just enough to pause him. "I wasn't talking to you," he said calmly. The room stilled. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was unmistakable. My brother froze. His expression caught somewhere between disbelief and offense. He hadn't been corrected like that before, not in front of me, not ever. His wife's eyes flicked between them, calculating, unsure which version of the evening she was now supposed to inhabit. My father turned back to me. "You always seem separate," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Not unhappy, just off to the side. I've never really asked why." There it was, not an accusation, not a defense, a question, one he had avoided for years because he'd assumed he already knew the answer. "I don't like competing," I said, "and I don't like making people uncomfortable." My brother scoffed softly, unable to stop himself. "You make it sound like we're the problem. You just never put yourself out there." My father looked at him, then really looked. "That's enough. Let her finish." I felt something loosen in my chest, something I hadn't realized was still tight. I continued, not raising my voice, not pressing my advantage. I learned early that when I spoke up, it became about how I said things instead of what I was saying. So I stopped trying to be heard. It wasn't about disappearing. It was about choosing peace. My father absorbed that quietly. He didn't interrupt. He didn't correct my memory on his own. My brother opened his mouth again, then closed it. The rules had changed, and he could feel it. "I always thought you were just independent," my father said slowly. "That you didn't need much." I met his eyes. Needing less isn't the same as being given less. The words hung between us heavy, but precise. He nodded once, the way he did when something settled into place, whether he liked it or not. "I should have paid more attention," he said. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a confession. But it was acknowledgement, and it landed deeper than anything louder ever could. Around us, the room felt smaller, more intimate. My brother shifted again, uncomfortable now, in a way that wasn't about losing attention, but about being seen too clearly. His wife touched his arm, a quiet signal to retreat. He didn't argue. He didn't joke. He fell silent. My father glanced between us, then back at me. "There are things about you that I think I never really asked about. I just assumed." I stood then, not to leave, but to level the space between us. "You can ask, when you're ready." He nodded again, more firmly this time. "I will." As we gathered our things, the dynamic remained altered, fragile, but real. Outside, the air was cool and clean. My father walked beside me toward the parking area, not ahead, not behind. It felt deliberate. Before we parted, he stopped and turned to me. "I'm glad you came tonight. I think I needed to see you like this." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't need to. Some things only surface when someone finally asks the right question. By morning, the questions had outpaced the politeness. What lingered from the night before wasn't embarrassment exactly, but unease, the kind that refuses to settle until it's given a shape. My brother was the first to give it direction. He couldn't stand not knowing who had paid, couldn't tolerate the idea that something significant had happened without his involvement. Control once disrupted, demands to be reclaimed. Over coffee that tasted like routine, he started making calls. His tone is crisp, almost friendly, the way people sound when they expect compliance. He asked about invoices, about authorization, about who had signed off on the evening. He framed it as housekeeping, as curiosity. The people on the other end of the line heard something else: insistence. The answers came back clean, too clean to bend. The event manager explained the payment had been settled weeks prior, the account cleared in full with explicit instructions not to disclose the source publicly. My brother pressed, voice tightening, suggesting there must be a record, a name, a reason. There was. The manager didn't hesitate. Ivy. Silent backer. Long-standing relationship. Paid in full as a personal gift. No credit requested. No announcement authorized. It wasn't said with drama or judgment. It was said the way facts usually are, without ornament, without concern for how they land. Silence followed on my brother's end, heavy and unmistakable. When he brought it to the family later that afternoon, he didn't present it as a discovery. He presented it as confusion, as if the truth had ambushed him rather than answered a question he'd forced. My father listened, his face shifting slowly through disbelief, then comprehension, then something closer to shame. The pieces aligned with an almost cruel efficiency: the owner's deference, the manager's familiarity, the gift without a name. All of it pointed in one direction, and none of it could be reframed into coincidence. No one looked at me right away. That was the strangest part. The truth was sitting there undeniable, and still they hesitated, as if acknowledging it aloud would make it real in a way they weren't prepared to handle. My brother stared at the table, jaw tight. His wife sat rigidly beside him, her earlier confidence nowhere to be found. The center of gravity had shifted this time irrevocably. My father broke first. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform with authority. He simply spoke, and the weight of the room followed his tone. "Is this true?" he asked. Not accusatory, not incredulous. Just tired. I nodded once. I didn't explain. I didn't justify. The truth didn't need support. He exhaled slowly, as if releasing something he'd been holding for years, without realizing it. "You paid for the whole thing," he said. It wasn't a question anymore. It was recognition. His eyes didn't leave mine. "And you didn't say a word." "I didn't do it to be thanked," I said. That was all. The silence that followed was dense, almost physical. My father's shoulders slumped slightly, the posture of someone confronted not with a single mistake, but with a pattern. He looked at my brother, then back at me. "I let you take credit," he said quietly, to no one and everyone at once. "I assumed. I didn't check. My brother opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was no version of the story left that centered him without collapsing under scrutiny. His wife glanced at him, then away, recalculating her place in a hierarchy that had just dissolved. "You're telling me," my brother finally said, his voice strained, "that you own part of that restaurant, that you've had money this whole time and never said anything. I built something. I said evenly. I didn't owe anyone a report. But the way you dress, the way you act, the way I dress has nothing to do with what I'm worth. You decided it did. That's on you." He looked like he wanted to argue to find the angle that would let him walk away with something intact, but there was nothing left to grab. "I'm sorry," my father said, and this time the words were directed fully at me. "I'm sorry for not seeing you, for letting you be dismissed, for thinking silence meant you didn't matter." He didn't add conditions. He didn't soften it with explanations. He said it in front of everyone, knowing exactly what it cost him to do so. I didn't rush to comfort him. I didn't wave it away. "I didn't do any of this to prove anything," I said. "I did it because it felt right. That's all." The words landed harder than any accusation could have. There was nowhere left to hide, no narrative to retreat into. "I don't want this brought up again." I continued setting the boundary I'd earned. Not as a favor, not as a story. I'm not interested in being the rescuer or the exception. I just want respect. My father nodded immediately. "You have it," he said, and for the first time it didn't sound like a promise he'd forget how to keep. The apology didn't fix the room. It didn't soften the air or suddenly return everyone to their places like a reset button. After my father spoke, the silence stretched on, awkward and unresolved, the kind that exposes how little language can do once something fundamental has been named. I realized then how deeply the myth of closure runs in families like mine. Say sorry, move on, restore order. But nothing in my body felt restored. The memories didn't dissolve because an apology had finally arrived. They lined up quietly, waiting to be acknowledged or ignored all over again. An apology didn't erase the past. It only created the possibility of a different future. Whether I stepped into that future or how close I stood to it was still my choice. That choice didn't belong to me alone for long. Within days, the pressure began subtle at first, dressed up as concern. A relative called to check in, voice warm, careful. "Your dad took it really hard," she said. "It meant a lot that he owned up to it. Families don't always get that." Another followed, gentler still. "You're strong. You can afford to be a bigger person." The message threaded through each conversation was the same now that the hard part was done. It was my responsibility to smooth the rest over. Forgiveness in their eyes wasn't a gift. It was an obligation. I listened without arguing. I'd learned long ago that pushing back against moral pressure only reinforces it. What they didn't see was the trap beneath their kindness. The scapegoat is always asked to absorb discomfort for the sake of peace. My brother tried a different approach. He caught me alone one afternoon at my father's house, finding me in the kitchen while I was pouring a glass of water. His footsteps were deliberate, unhurried. He leaned against the counter arms, crossed his tone casual, almost nostalgic. "Hey," he said. "Got a minute?" I didn't turn around. "Sure." "Look, I've been thinking." He paused and I could hear him shifting his weight. "I didn't know you were doing all that. The restaurant, the investment stuff. If I had, things would have been different." I turned to face him then. He was wearing the same expression he always wore when he wanted something open, reasonable, the picture of a man willing to meet halfway. I'd seen that face 1,000 times, at family dinners when he wanted the last word, in arguments when he wanted to be declared the peacemaker. It was the face of someone who believed his own narrative so completely that he couldn't imagine anyone seeing through it. "Different how?" I asked. He blinked, caught off guard by the question. "I mean, I wouldn't have said what I said at the party, you know." "What did you say?" His smile flickered. "Come on, Ivy. You know what I mean." "I want to hear you say it." The warmth in his expression cooled by a degree. "I made a joke about your dress. It was stupid. I didn't mean anything by it." There it was, the familiar deflection. It was a joke. I didn't mean it. the words designed to make the problem my reaction rather than his action. "You said I couldn't afford new clothes," I said, keeping my voice level. "You said secondhand was all I deserved, in front of everyone, at Dad's birthday party. That's not—" He stopped himself, recalibrating. "Okay, fine. It came out wrong. But you know how I am. I joke around. I've always been like that. You used to laugh." "No," I said. "I used to stay quiet. That's not the same thing." He stared at me for a long moment, and I watched something shift behind his eyes. Not understanding. Calculation. He was trying to figure out a new angle, a different approach that might work better. "Look," he said, his voice softening into something meant to sound vulnerable. "I know things have been weird between us, and maybe I haven't been the best brother. But we're family Ivy. We can get past this. Remember when we were kids? We used to be close. We used to tell each other everything." I did remember. I remembered being 12 and idolizing him, following him around the house, laughing at all his jokes because I wanted him to like me. I remembered being 15 and realizing that his attention only came when he needed something. I remembered being 20 and watching him take credit for a project I'd helped him with, smiling at our father's praise while I stood in the corner invisible. "We were never close," I said quietly. "I was just available." His face hardened. The mask slipped just for a moment, and I saw the irritation underneath, the frustration of a man who wasn't getting what he wanted. "Fine," he said, pushing off from the counter. "Be that way. I'm trying to fix things here, and you're just—" He waved his hand vaguely. "Whatever. I don't know what you want from me. I want you to stop pretending you don't know what you did." I said I was sorry. "No, you said you didn't mean it. That's not an apology. That's an excuse." He stared at me, and for a moment I thought he might actually hear me, that something I'd said might land somewhere real. Then his wife appeared in the doorway, her timing too perfect to be coincidental. She'd been listening, I realized, waiting for the right moment to intervene. "Is everything okay here?" she asked, her voice light, her eyes sharp. My brother turned to her with visible relief. "Yeah, we're done." He walked past her without looking back. She lingered for a moment, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not hostility, something more careful than that. Assessment. "He really is trying," she said finally, "in his own way." "I know," I said. "That's the problem." She held my gaze for another beat, then turned and followed her husband out of the kitchen. I stood there alone, the glass of water still in my hand, and felt something settle into place. Not anger, not sadness, clarity. He wasn't going to change, not because he couldn't, but because he didn't believe he needed to. In his mind, the problem wasn't what he'd done, it was that I'd reacted badly. If I would just accept his non-apology, laugh it off, return to my place in the hierarchy, everything could go back to normal. But I was done being normal. Later, my father asked if we could talk. We sat across from each other in his study, the room where he'd always conducted serious conversations. No audience, no performance. The evening light came through the window, casting long shadows across the desk between us. He didn't start with explanations. He asked a question instead. "What do you need from me now?" It was the first time he'd ever asked me that without attaching an expectation to the answer. I took a breath. I'd been preparing for this conversation without realizing it, rehearsing words in my head during sleepless nights and quiet mornings. "I need you to see me," I said. "Not the version of me that's convenient. Not the quiet one who doesn't cause problems. Me." He nodded slowly, waiting. "I need you to stop comparing us. Me and him. I need you to stop assuming that because I don't ask for attention, I don't need it. I need you to remember that I exist even when I'm not in the room." I paused, feeling the weight of years pressing against my chest. "And I need you to understand that I'm not angry anymore. I'm just tired. I'm tired of proving myself. I'm tired of being invisible. I'm tired of watching everyone else get credit for things I've done." He was quiet for a long moment. I watched his face, looking for the familiar signs of dismissal, the tightening of the jaw, the glance away, the breath that preceded a but. They didn't come. "I didn't know," he said finally. "I didn't know you felt that way. I tried to tell you. Many times. I know. He looked down at his hands. I wasn't listening. I thought... He stopped, shook his head. It doesn't matter what I thought. I was wrong. Yes, I said. You were. He looked up at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw my father look genuinely uncertain, not performing humility, actually feeling it. I can't undo it, he said. But I can stop doing it. I can start paying attention. I can ask instead of assuming. He paused. I know that's not enough, but it's what I can offer. That mattered. It didn't heal everything, but it shifted something real. For the first time, I believed he meant what he was saying, not because he'd found the right words, but because he'd stopped trying to find them. He was just sitting there, uncomfortable, uncertain, willing to be seen as someone who'd failed. That was more than he'd ever given me before. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't the same as reconciliation. I could let go of resentment without reopening every door. I could wish them well without placing myself back in a position that required constant self-erasure. Mercy didn't have to look like proximity. Sometimes it looked like distance, clear, calm, unapologetic. When I told them my decision, we were all together. My father, my brother, his wife. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't wait for the perfect moment. I just said it. I'll still be there for important things, birthdays, holidays, but I'm not engaging in comparisons or power struggles anymore. If that starts, I'll step away, immediately, without explanation. I didn't ask if that was okay. I stated it as fact. My father's face fell just slightly. He was disappointed, but he didn't argue. I understand, he said, and for the first time I believed him. My brother bristled. So what, you're just going to... Yes, I said, cutting him off. I am. Sure. He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. His wife touched his arm, a small gesture that might have been comfort, or might have been warning. He sat back in his chair, jaw tight, clearly offended by the loss of access, but unsure how to fight for something he'd never realized he was taking. His wife said nothing, but I could see her reassessing, recalculating. The hierarchy she'd married into was shifting beneath her feet, and she wasn't sure yet where she would land. Each of them lost something familiar in that moment: control, comfort, certainty. None of it was taken aggressively. It was simply no longer available. In the quiet that followed, something unexpected settled in. Not triumph, not vindication. Peace, measured and real. I no longer felt pulled to justify my distance or explain my choices. They didn't need to agree for it to be valid. I stood up, and no one moved to stop me. I walked to the door, and no one called me back. I stepped outside into the evening air, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt light. I had spent years believing acceptance was the price of belonging. I knew better now. Belonging that requires self-betrayal isn't belonging at all. A few weeks passed, and life didn't snap back into place the way people like to pretend it does after a confrontation. There was no montage of healing, no sudden warmth flooding old rooms. The family still gathered, still spoke, still shared meals, but the rhythm had changed. The forced closeness was gone. So was the easy cruelty. What replaced it was quieter, more careful, and at first unfamiliar. I wasn't seated at the edge anymore, but I also wasn't pulled into the center. I chose where I stood now, and that choice held. The changes showed up in small, undeniable ways. My father began asking before deciding, not as a performance, but as a habit he was clearly learning in real time. He stopped boasting about his children altogether, as if he'd realized how hollow that language had been. My brother no longer joked at my expense. He kept his distance respectful, but guarded his confidence recalibrated into something flatter. His wife treated me with a polite neutrality that carried just enough caution to acknowledge the new boundaries. No one apologized again. They didn't need to. Behavior is louder than words when it's consistent. I returned to the restaurant one afternoon alone. No celebration, no family, no expectations attached. The place was calm, operating in its everyday rhythm, and I felt more like myself there than I ever had during the party. David greeted me by name, the same way he always had, with a nod that recognized partnership without elevating it into spectacle. We spoke briefly about operations, about plans that extended beyond any single night. The expansion is on track, he said, sliding a folder across the table. The second location opens in 4 months. The numbers are better than projected. I reviewed the pages, satisfied with what I saw. 3 years of patient investment, quiet support, calculated decisions, all of it building towards something sustainable. I want to increase my stake, I said. Another $200,000. Use it for the staff training program we discussed. He nodded, unsurprised. He'd learned by now that my involvement came without strings, without demands for visibility. There's something else, he said, hesitating slightly. A group of investors approached me last month. They want to buy out your shares. Offer 3 times what you put in. I set down my coffee. What did you tell them? That I'd ask you, but I already know the answer. I smiled slightly. The answer is no. I'm not interested in a quick return. I'm interested in what we're building. He exhaled, relieved. That's what I told them. Sitting there, I thought about how often my silence had been misunderstood. There were years when it had been mistaken for weakness, when it was simply endurance. I had absorbed more than I should have, believing restraint was the same as strength. Now silence felt different. It wasn't something pressed onto me. It was something I chose, a tool rather than a shield. The difference lived in my posture, in the way I left rooms without scanning for approval, in how I spoke, without preparing defenses in advance. I remembered the girl I used to be at gatherings like that birthday party, counting the seconds until it was socially acceptable to leave rehearsing neutral responses in case anyone noticed her presence long enough to comment on it. I remembered the exhaustion of always being ready to explain myself and the relief of realizing I didn't have to. The transformation hadn't been loud. It had been cumulative, a series of choices that finally aligned. Taking my power back had never been about embarrassing anyone or watching them fall apart. It wasn't about proving my worth with receipts or revealing everything I'd built in secret. Power was the freedom to stop negotiating my value. It was the ability to walk away from narratives that required me to be smaller so others could feel tall. I didn't need to tell my whole story to be respected. I only needed to stop participating in stories that erased me. The family dynamic didn't repair itself overnight, and it didn't need to. What mattered was that the old roles no longer fit. I wasn't the one smoothing over tension, translating emotions, or absorbing discomfort to keep things pleasant. Without that role, the family had to adjust or sit with the friction they'd avoided for years. On my way out of the restaurant, I paused briefly, not to look back, but to acknowledge the shift. I didn't need anyone to understand all of me. I didn't need recognition or redemption. I needed autonomy, and I had it. That was enough. I drove home with the windows down the city moving around me without resistance. The quiet felt earned, not imposed. For the first time, I wasn't measuring myself against anyone else's expectations. I wasn't wondering how I was being perceived. I was present in my own life, grounded in choices I could stand behind. I'm not who I was. I don't need to be. And I don't need permission to say that. If you've ever been judged by your appearance, underestimated, because you didn't fit someone else's definition of success, I hope this story reminded you of something important. Your worth isn't determined by the people who refuse to see it. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop explaining yourself and start living on your own terms. Do you think distance is harder than forgiveness, or the other way around? If this story stayed with you, leave a comment. I read them all. And if you made it this far, thank you for staying. If you want more stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.